Am I visible and audible?
Yeah, you are.
Okay, I'm gonna record my own speech, but since I think everyone has consented also to the recording, I'm also wearing headphones. So for DLO, don't worry. Oh, sorry, second half. Yeah, you're not gonna be like heard if ever. Okay. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. We propose this motion with two important pushes: that there's a grave urgency in joining the EAEU in the midst of conflict, politically and economically, and that their non participation makes them much more vulnerable in the coming years. Note, in the game of international relations, survival, positioning, and strategy are the main elements of the game. We may not guarantee they can achieve all their win conditions and get along with everybody, but we actively lessen the possibility of certain defeat. If politics is a game of likelihoods, side with prop. I have 5 discussions that are going to be very important to launch. The first is to talk about what really is the situation now. We think a lot of things have been going on, so let's point it out. Politically speaking, there's increasing tensions surrounding Central Asia as a whole. Iran and Afghanistan below them are still facing inflation, civil conflicts, and active threats from other neighboring nations. China, on their right, is testing nukes nearby and are sending a lot of unsavory threats internationally. Russia, right above them, are on their march for more land to claim, though they are losing, and this is going to be important later. And the EAEU member Georgia on the left is also facing a lot of economic uncertainty. They will eventually be dragged into the conflict physically if they are not already been economically. Which brings us to the second thing to point out here, because economically speaking, a lot of things have been going on as well. The US tariffs creating a ripple effect across the board, nearby with India, which affects Central Asia directly, with China, who has a 34 increase in all of the imports and exports that they have to face, Afghanistan, who is recovering from inflation, even Europe as a whole, who has to contend with the Independence Day that Trump recently launched. So these states have very little to no ability to survive on their own merits, economically speaking, because a lot of their exports rely on raw minerals and oil. Their best exports of oil will be subject now to huge taxes for their main buyer, which is the United States and China, because of all of the tariff wars going on. And their ability to sustain themselves economically are now hinged on Russia buying their oil, as they've claimed is going to be their pivot or plan C, because plan B was relying on everyone else around them, but Trump attacked them as well. So they are increasingly being targeted for raw minerals, especially in light of the AI race as well. So they really are in a vulnerable position. They have to choose what to do. So the next thing I'm going to talk about, discussion 2, what are we going to do now? Before that, POI, yes.
So, regarding the security concerns, this is a purely economic union. Why not join the CST or any other security organization?
All right, because the battle primarily lies in the economic nature of things. Like, yes, a lot of the times, a lot of neighboring countries already have an incentive to protect them when it comes to like physical conflicts that may arise. But economically speaking, so long as they're not interdependent with other nations, then they have no active incentive to cater to those specific needs as well. So the next thing I want to talk about, discussion 2, what are in our interests now? We'd say economic protection and sustainability. We also talk about political leverage internationally to make sure that people care about what's happening to us economically. It's also to cater to the clamors of their people who are actively terrified the midst of economic uncertainty with prices threatening to rise. So a lot of people in the region know Russia is bad, that they're not preferable, but they also think everyone else is bad. So right now their priority is who can keep food on the table. What will membership look like? As raised by Mikko, it's a purely pragmatic one in nature. Like, look at Armenia, who, let's be real, ain't really cozy with Russia after everything that's been happening, but they still benefit highly from the economic safety that they get because there's secured trade routes because of the tide economic activity. There is now more incentive as well for Russia to mandate that Azerbaijan not take advantage of Russia's preoccupation with the Ukrainian invasion. It can order Azerbaijani forces out of the Lanchin corridor to give breather to Armenia, etc. There's also political leeway and some level of autonomy when it comes to their economic activity. There's preferential trading relations. There's also shared good and services. That's just like the basics of everything. But we do know that a shared currency is being planned. That might be a main push of op. But we suspect and we have reason to believe that this is going to be withheld in the midst of conflict. So I don't think it's the active and main consideration right now. If you do want to talk about it, sure, my deputy is ready. But I don't think that's realistic given everything going on. So other countries are also hesitant to merge their financials in this way because of ongoing conflicts. So it is in the plans. It has been planned for years, actually. I don't think it's going to like come into fruition anytime soon. The third thing I'd like to discuss is how does this help the Central Asian states, right? Besides staving off everything that I've talked about, we also get a lot of political protection because, as I mentioned, a lot of these conflicts are not just material in nature, they're economic at their core. Because you have protection from external elements such as tariffs, as well as aggression from the United States when it comes to these tariffs and taxes. You also have protection against the EAEU themselves. Because let's face it, with all of the damages happening now, because they prioritize protecting each other in the midst of all these rises and inflations, they will turn to everyone else, even if it means having to trample on them along the way. The goal of Central Asia is to make sure they're not on that particular warpath. No one is trying to be friends. Let's be real. This is not a principled thing. This is purely pragmatic. And as a side benefit, you also have protection in instances of war. There's a revitalization of landmine production in these EAEU nations because of the fact that they're staving off upcoming threats. And so you get access to those things as well. But even if you don't directly, economically speaking, we see that there's going to be a bump, there's going to be a rise in the sale of these things, which is going to be beneficial across the board. Economically, we'd say, as I mentioned, you have interdependent economic activity. That means when you tie your economies with theirs, there's less likely chance that you will be targeted when it comes to the inflation. They're likely going to not offset all of the damages that they're facing to you because it will also directly affect them as well. This is the most important impact because, as I mentioned, Central Asia, their priority right now is not to politically take over the world, it's just to survive. And the people on the ground are the people who are most affected as they face the brunt of these issues with the rising prices, inflation, and the lack of alternatives available to them because of all the trade routes being blocked left and right. Preemptions now, because they might say that Russia doesn't need anything from these countries. That's not true. Russia is currently undergoing multiple trade sanctions. In fact, they're looking for more trading partners. This is the perfect opportunity for Central Asian countries to position themselves to be part of this. Their main buyer of oil right now, Trump, has made an enemy of the world, so they need to find a new one. China is also aggressively paying taxes on imports of raw materials, so they're not a viable actor to go in cahoots with as well. This also locks out, they might also say this locks out other countries from being able to form economic trades with them. I don't think this is an issue because these countries also have trade routes with China, etc. But they might also say it makes it easier for annexation later in the future by Russia. If that's were a threat, it would have happened already. I don't think that's priority. Mikko's POI also says that they're not concerned with the war route. We've given preemptions to that, but at its core, this is an economic debate at its nature. What's their burdens? Their burdens to show why economic sustainability is possible for them to achieve without this, how they fend off threats on their side, and how they are likely to get support from other actors when, as I've mentioned, they have other concerns that are more important to them. For all these reasons, please propose.
Okay, thank you. Welcoming Alo.
Hello, am I audible? Sorry.
Yes, you are.
Thank you. I'll take POIs through chat. Give me a second. Okay. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Having membership in one of the most fluctuating states and region blocks in the world is just doomed for Central Asian states. This will make them deprived even more from economic ability to trade with different countries, but also to sustain themselves in a world of financial fluctuations. The first response and only response that I have is their idea on, well, states are weak. You need this to have political protections because they would otherwise have sanctioned you. I want to note a tension within their case. They say that these Central Asian states are weak, they're poor, and rely on a lot of varieties of trade, but then say that there's such a big threat towards Russia and the general area that they would like to sanction them in the cases that they don't join in these regional blocs. The first question is why, how, Clearly, if they are weaker, it's not big enough of a threat for them. But secondly, I'm not sure why the comparative doesn't similarly happen on their side. If they did join the EAEU, presumably the EU, the US, when you are closer in ties with Russia, are likely to double down sanctions on you. And so at best, this is a wash and not something and not a comparative that they could win at. They don't explain why sanctions are resolved on their side. If that's the case they want to run, they're clearly losing this debate. First argument. Why is the lack of membership allow for better individual decision making and access to better trade partners? The first question I want to explain is how you get more access to better trade partners. Why do people want to trade with Central Asian states, particularly and most feasibly the EU? We'd explain this for three broad reasons. The first is because of existing oil scarcity. Central Asia has oil. The US is just less willing to trade externally. Russia right now is less likely to give you oil because politically it's bad, and the US is going to sanction you in comparison to these things. So individuals need different alternatives towards accessing oil right now, especially the EU, right? Where the hottest political issue is next to immigration is actually energy. And therefore, the desperation caused by the lack of access to supplies of oil and the increasing price of energy mean that they have to turn towards different alternatives which Central Asia can opt into. And that's why the EU is more likely to trade with you, absent your membership within the EAEU, which could associate you with Russia. Secondly, it's that the EU is looking for new trading partners, i.e. the US was their former largest buyer of goods, and now they have reciprocal taxation that meant that it's much harder for them to not only buy in a lot of EU imports, but also to trade with other countries. The good thing about this is that if the EU trades more with you now, you can not only tax their goods, which is good for you, but they're likely to trade with you because you likely have lower tariff rates, which is just better for them and more beneficial to them to somewhat fill that gap that the US left behind when they became more isolationist. But thirdly, it was strategic and security interests, i.e. things like the contagion between refugee crisis within Central Asia and broadly Europe that came from Gulf states or general Asia areas within Europe, or things like wanting to stop conflict spillovers between Afghanistan or different Gulf states and stop things like Chinese and Russian investment through proxy wars. All of these reasons explain to you not only why EU is likely to invest in you and trade with you, but also why there's active incentive to maintain good partnerships with you, which you automatically break down by the point of which you join the EAEU. There's clear impacts to this. One, we don't need to prove that they're the sole partner, only that a significant amount of trading happens. But secondly, it's why you don't need to join the Economic Union, because there already exists different metrics for how you're able to access these things outside of that union. Secondly, how do even if you didn't believe that, how are Central Asian states better able to make independent decisions? We'd explain they make better independent decisions than what would be told for them within the EAEU for three reasons. One, they would gradually open up regardless, right? It's not a world in which you have free trade and it's completely restrictive under our side. Clearly, there are many market reasons as to why it is the case. Goods are much cheaper. You have more access to markets. You need to satisfy cronies at the point of which you're an authoritarian state in Central Asia. All of these things generally mean that gradual opening up to trade, even access to EU, is just generally good for you and something that's naturally going to happen. Secondly, at the very least, you're sure that these economic policies serve your interests, as opposed to the EAEU, which will probably prioritize mature economies given you're at different economic phases. That just meant it's harder for you to do things like export into different countries to maintain trade relations when the broad voting power and trade relations, or I guess trade policies that are created, are in the interest of already existing states like Russia and Kazakhstan. But thirdly, if you are extremely corrupt, it's not our burden to remove corruption. What we'd explain is that it's their interest to decide how they want to open markets, which they lose when they join these things. And that's why it's in the interest of these states, because dictators actively want to be able to dictate how markets open up and how they control their economy, which can only happen when you aren't dictated by broader states like Russia that could militarily threaten you. Second argument. Why would joining mean a destroyed domestic economy and the bloc being simply incompatible with Central Asian states? Three reasons. The first is we aren't exactly sure how you're beneficial or how this agreement is beneficial to you. This is because of three reasons. One, it's currency instability. Especially with a common currency, this is just terrible. The Russian ruble is collapsed from all of these sanctions. It's an unstable currency that you couldn't possibly rely on or peg, and you don't want to depend on a fluctuating currency that not just affects your internal trade or your internal economy, but also external trade with other countries and trust from investors to get capital inflows. Secondly, it's capital inflows and outflows that will be difficult to regulate. And there's a lesson we've learned from weaker European states that joined into the EU. Things like Croatia or Bulgaria. where Bulgaria had issues retaining the smart youth and had a projected growth of 2% instead of the supposed 7% for developing economies that is the normal standard. And this is because brain drain happens, because you open up your economy to the free movement of labor when your own country is comparatively not enticing, and therefore you lose a lot of investment, you lose a lot of research, you lose a lot of labor that would have otherwise developed your economy, but now move to different states that are now able to have free movement because you joined into these things in the first place. Sure, I'll take that POI.
You can't just strawman my case and ignore the nuances. How do you guarantee a plethora of trade partners when individual trade partnerships are currently unfavored by major nations who prioritize their own nations and the unions they are already in?
Like we already explained this, right? The EU is looking for oil. They rely on you for oil. Very clearly, if they can't access Russia, the only other metric for which they're able to get this and solve their energy crisis, even with existing trade partners, is to expand, which happens in Central Asia. That's why they like you. Also, a broad host of different reasons. Listen to that part of the speech. Second, we'd explained to you that it's trade and export dumping that is the issue, where the size and economy and goods are much bigger and produced much faster. You can't tariff these things. You can't limit these things. You can't compete. And it's worse when the goods you trade are similar. It's things like oil that every country in this, not in the EAEU, including Central Asia, trades with. That means, one, you don't necessarily benefit from these things, but two, you might also lose trading partners like China and India that already existed that were pertinent to you. The impact of this is clear. You shatter domestic economies and leave you more dependent on the EAEU and insecure if the economy crashes regionally. But lastly, it's different economic phases. Who will they listen to in voting? Is it the stronger military, mature economy, or the new guy who joined with likely little say? Clearly, you couldn't control these things. It's much left up to the debate. All these reasons explain to you why you're more secure under our side. Oppose.
Thank you, Alo. Welcome, DPM.
Hello, am I visible and audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, if my mic cuts out, just please tell me because it does that. Um, uh, POIs through voice, but make it a bit loud. Okay.
Hello.
Hi. Can everyone hear and see me? Sorry about that, the POI.
Yeah, we can hear and see you.
Thanks. All right, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Let's have a very simple speech. I want to talk about exports, imports, and everything in between. Firstly, on exports. So exports are good because you're able to sell goods produced in your country. That creates cash inflows because other countries are buying your products, and you're able to create jobs, that's wages, and overall people in your country have money, and that's a good thing. Most notably, the exports within Central Asian states are primarily oil, most of which Russia and Kazakhstan are also quite dependent on. They are large oil-dependent economies. Why then is joining the EAEU with fairly similar economic conditions quite a bad policy? The first thing, I agree with PM. This means preferential trade. You have to prefer trade within your bloc and make it harder to have trade outside your bloc. That's the whole point of having these kinds of unions. Why is that a bad idea? The first thing is to ask, why will Russia buy your oil? They are an oil exporting country. They sufficiently produce for themselves. And therefore, you are making trade easier within a bloc where they do not need your product. That is already quite a silly thing to do. And the comparative of that is that it makes it harder to negotiate and deal with other countries because you now no longer have independence over your own trade policy. You need to agree with everybody else in the region on what the external trade policy ought to be. Secondly, what is that external trade policy going to be? It's likely that competing oil producers like Kazakhstan and Russia are going to make policies that are far more beneficial for themselves, and they have more power in this bloc than you because they are much larger than you. There are many examples of that already. So if they strike a deal to export oil, most of that oil will come from Kazakhstan and Russia. If they make a deal to be able to export oil, they can do things like engage in dangerous oil price wars like they did with Saudi Arabia and cut the price of oil significantly. And you have no option but to cut as well because you are within the bloc. You need a common policy. All you can do is to sell cheap oil, which therefore means lesser jobs and lesser wages for the people within your country. You lose any sense of independence here. Whereas if we are able to prove a significant counterfactual, we think that is going to give you optionality as a country rather than be forced to follow along. Thirdly, a lot of the countries right now do not want to deal with Russia. It's fairly politically unpopular, not just because of the controversy and being able to deal with the war in Ukraine, but also because it's seen as a volatile political actor that tying your economy to it is just untenable, which means that countries that might have seen you as a viable partner, but now look at you as an association to Russia, are much less willing and able to do so, which means less exports as well. Fourthly, I want to note, their case on Russia is that they are currently economically weak, and therefore it's the perfect time to position ourselves. They've always been economically weak. Russia has never had a global superpower GDP. Quite notably, a lot of Russian power comes from their military strength and their capacity to coerce through physical means. Why is that important? What that means is it is very unstrategic to build an economic alliance with a fairly weak economic country. Why is that the case? The first thing is, you might ask, given the interdependence, they won't invade you because harm to you will also harm themselves. This is true for rational countries. And that was everyone's calculus with Russia invading Ukraine, which is that the war in Ukraine would be significantly more detrimental to Russia than to Ukraine. But what you note about Russia is that it is an autocracy that is built on nationalistic and personal ego, which means that they are willing to harm themselves so that Putin can sell to his people that he is once again a hero. And what that entails is that even if there was interdependence, the first thing is, as a small country, your degree of dependence on Russia is far greater than their dependence on you. If you engaged in any kind of violence, it wouldn't hurt them very much. The second thing is, even if it hurt them, they are far more willing to do so. The better comparative is to therefore cut that interdependence to begin with and ensure that you are instead able to economically provide for yourself. All of these things show this is just not a very smart move. What then are your alternatives? Because they give the context of great instability, of rising inflation, and a series of tariffs. Guess what? That is good for these countries. Because when the US is seen as an unpopular and unstable actor, where does the EU get its oil? Because it's no longer able to get that from Russia. And to be clear, America is not an oil importing country. It is an oil exporting country after the discovery of fracking during the Obama administration and the ability to export shale. The important thing, therefore, is that given that Trump is tariffing everybody to hell, everyone is looking for new trade partners. This is not going to change the EU by a large amount, but the EU wants to get oil where it can. Especially one of the most politically important issues throughout the European Union right now is high energy prices as a consequence of expensive oil. They want to be able to negotiate in that area. Multiple other incentives, right? Being able to generally create greater ties in the area that they had not access to before Russia can. Building diplomatic interests there to ensure that things like refugee crisis don't get significantly worse before they reach European borders. All of these things show that there is an alternative, and quite importantly, a strong one that we do not need to depend on such a strong but volatile country for. I'll take the POI now.
If that alternative was true, it would have already happened. But it hasn't because directly between them is Ukraine, which makes it very hard for them to get oil from Central Asia.
If this alternative was true, it would have already happened. It's quite nice because it's only been a week. We cannot expect all of these policies to change when Liberation Day has only recently happened. We are constantly changing the nature of European economic policy. And you can see that all the time right now. The further and further ties that are being cut to America and being placed somewhere else because people have lost faith in America. This can happen. We shouldn't have given it a 1 week deadline for it to happen. I don't think it's a very good intuition pump. Lastly, I want to talk about imports. Why is it really bad to import and have a country in an economic zone that you have the same main product with? The first thing is, if Russia, and by the way they do, are better and are cheaper at exporting oil, your own domestic industries start to import it as well. That was the problem with the Philippines because so many other agricultural countries were better at exporting the same products that we made. What that means is you kill domestic industries that are quite dependent already, that you're already quite dependent on within the country. Secondly is, even if that's not the case for oil, that is the case for so many other things. And notably, you cannot tax imported goods in an European Economic EAEU because there is a free movement of goods. And that means even when you import goods, you cannot profit off of them at all. You are only giving money to another country and are therefore unable to make meaningful profits off of that. The last thing to point out here is that all of these imports are also accompanied by the exportation of labor. Every smart young individual that is graduating with a university degree from these countries is looking for a better life in Astana, is looking for a better life somewhere else other than these Central Asian states. What that means is the further diversification of your industry to services and smarter and more advanced sectors can no longer happen either. I'm very, very proud to oppose.
Okay, thank you. Diallo, welcoming Cafe.
Hi. Wait a sec. I am going to record my speech. I'm wearing earphones anyway, so like your ice rays will not be heard. Eh, Okay. Wait for this. The oft-repeated adage holds true in this debate. When monkeys are together, they are stronger, especially in the face of other predators in the jungle. We propose. The first issue that I want to talk about is on economic development. We've been very clear, coming from Nina, that right now, Central Asian states who aren't a part of the Union, whose best exports are probably oil, petroleum, or minerals, for example, cannot rely on traditional buyers. Talk about US and China being in a particularly volatile like position as of the moment, right? So their next best bet would have to be Russia. Nina also told you that as part of the union, similar to other arrangements in other parts of the globe, like the EU, for example, more powerful members, for example, are probably going to are incentivized to economically protect the weaker members of that particular union, especially in our world where when the very same people of these more powerful nations use the same trade routes. What this means is in our union, which is born out, right, economically, this sometimes might bleed into something that is physical. For example, securing trade routes, or as how Carlo puts it, talk about convoys and the multitude of illustrations coming from Nina. Their first push coming from opposition is, why not just join explicit like security oriented union? This is fair, but likely these nations are more incentivized to not fight each other, not compete with each other economically, because one country's asset is another country's. We also told you that in comparison to their side, you're probably better insulated to all the trade wars that is going on, considering how the US basically had AI to formulate its tariff, because the benefit of being in a particular union is you're probably more enticing to trade with. You probably have more leverage on scale to actually transact with the EU, for example, even with the nascent like China, Japan, South Korea alliance that is forming as of the moment. So you're probably more of an enticing market on our world as opposed on their side. So the comparative at this point is on our side, these central, like tiny central, the TANs basically have more leverage on scale. considering the common industries that they have, they probably would have access to the same trading partners, and they're probably going to be all the more enticing. LO said that these tiny nations have leverage already because EU wants oil. So there's no need for these tiny Central Asian nations to actually merge together. What's probably going to end up happening on their side is, for example, if Turkmenistan wants to trade with the EU, Turkmenistan has its own rules, or particular holds its grounds, for example. EU might disagree and would just end up probably try to find another Central Asian nation on their side. So what's going to end up happening is, if Central Asian nations would trade as individuals to bigger economic blocs on their side, they're probably going to force to capitulate to the demands of these bigger trading blocs because they don't have an incentive to protect each other and lessen competition amongst themselves, right? So at this point, even DLO's mitigatory response only works if nations stop becoming self-interested in the face of the volatility coming from US and China. No, EU is probably going to even if they want oil, they're probably going to want it the cheapest, right? The additional response to this is, given the location of the EU, right? They're blocked by what's happening right now with Ukraine and Russia. This is important because what ends up happening on their side is they don't have any access whatsoever to the the market in the EU, as opposed on our side, when as a union, they can probably ask Russia to, secure their routes, for example, in order for them to access that particular market. They cannot the likelihood is less likely for their side of the house to actually be able to trade with the EU at the end of the day. So compare this, for example, when as a union in our world, and EU wants to trade with you, you probably have more leverage, more bargaining power to actually negotiate with the EU. If EU wants oil, they have to negotiate with them. They have to negotiate with the demands of the whole region, right? So in conclusion, the conclusion of this comparative is simple. Monkey together are indeed strong. Then LO said the next push coming from them is that weaker states are probably going to hold back all of these stronger states. They told you about how Bulgaria only had a growth of 2% as opposed to the projected 7% growth. The first response is a growth of 2% is still growth, even if it is slow. But the second is, at least it's better now, considering how volatile all of these economic trade conditions have been, as well as all the security conditions that we have to take into consideration that has been illustrated and has been ignored coming from Nina. But before 6, sure.
So as your first speaker agreed, this is a primarily economic debate. Can you be the first speaker in your team to explain what exactly do you trade with Russia?
It's not just about trading with Russia. We already preempted that coming from Nina. But probably Russia, this is the high time that Russia can assert itself, considering how volatile all of its rivals are, which actually leads me to my second discussion point. Sure, security isn't as much of a issue coming according to opposition, but it actually bleeds into that, as both of my constructive speaker hinted at, because the likelihood of these countries to protect each other significantly increases because they're doing economics together, right? And this is urgent, considering that the Central Asia is an island amidst this sea of conflict surrounding it. So Nina at the top of her speech already told you about this. So survival is paramount, considering this particular context. This is the incentive that Russia has. So more than being able to probably trade with Russia, and probably Russia already has all of these industries that all the Central Asian nations have. This is the only chance for Russia to actually assert itself in the jungle that the international community is, considering how volatile both of its rivals are. US is it's holding a tantrum because you have a Cheeto at its head. You have China already being frazzled and already trying to mend broken historical connections with South Korea and Japan. So this means this is the time for Russia now to actually assert itself, have its own group of allies band together, and probably assert themselves in this particular jungle. considering all of these reasons, do vote for us. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcoming Upward.
So they want the block.
Hello, sorry. All right. I'll take POIs to the chat, please. Okay. I have two issues. First is on the agency of these countries, and second is on economic benefits. But before I go on, I want to quickly explain what the true comparative is. From first speaker, we gave you multiple reasons as to why the EU will trade with you. They need oil. They have security interest in Central Asia. And if you need other reasons, they are logistically close as compared to, for example, other trading partners. They have existing investment in Central Asia already, and they want to make sure these investments materialize. If you need another reason, they care about food security, primarily because a lot of these places lack food. And then, like, because of the Europe, for example, trying to increase agricultural subsidies, especially when Ukraine cannot produce as much anymore, they get it from Central Asia. All of those demonstrate that there are multiple reasons as to why they cannot let go of Central Asia. At no point does this team actually respond to them. Then they say at WIP and at second that the new benefit now is that Central Asian countries won't compete with one another. So if it is true that you are in the same industry or the same market, at least you won't try to undercut one another. The first thing is, this is already preempted. Why? If it is true that the model then is consolidation, then you just consolidate towards the most powerful actors that already exist within this union, like Kazakhstan, like Russia. So I'm just unsure as to why it's beneficial for these small countries that are just entering. But secondly, their claim on how Russia protects your roots is factually incorrect. Russia blocked Nord Stream primarily because, for example, it undercut the amount, the markup they had for oil, because if it meant that oil was more accessible, it meant that they had to sell it for lower prices. So in fact, there's incentive for Russia to jeopardize a lot of these routes instead of what they're saying. Now I want to talk about agency. So I want to talk about it in two ways. First is on economic and territorial, and second is on political. First, let's talk about economic and territorial. They say, at the very least, Russia won't invade you. And that's the primary claim that you hear from Deputy. First, I actually think that the integration makes it easier for Russia to invade you. Why? One, a lot of the people right now on the ground currently hate Russia, primarily because, for example, they view that the era when they were under the Soviet Union was very bad for them. It was a dictatorship, they were very poor, etc. Why is it so important? Because at the point where, for example, you allow more tightly integrated with Russia, you can't, for example, spread anti-Russia propaganda anymore. You would generally allow the sentiment, anti-Russian sentiment, to lessen with time. So it becomes easier, and there's likely less backlash in the case where Russia likes to integrate with you. But secondly, if you have the same currency, if you have the same economic institutions, Russia can just literally economically capture your country and then politically and militarily capture it after. So I'm just unsure as to why any of these things are true. The second thing we explain is that trading with the EU guarantees some form of protection. This is the comparative they don't respond to. Why is it so important? If you notice right now, Russia is weak. That's why, for example, they agreed to the 2-week ceasefire. The important thing right now is that when we side with the EU, i.e. we're now an important way that the EU, for example, gets oil for them to manufacture, for them to industrialize the vast majority of their industries, by the way, that means that they will protect us as opposed to, for example, Russia, that also oftentimes views us as direct competition and will likely, for example, undercut us within this union. That is a direct comparison. On political, what we explain is what often happens to these countries is that you impose economic policies that do not agree with the rest of the people. That has no response. I want to talk about economic unions. So I will explain why the features of an economic union is incompatible and harmful to these particular countries. So the first thing that they talk about is protection from protectionism. So in other words, you don't get tariffs. The first response to this is that they're unlikely to tariff you in the first place, especially if the characterization is that you're so weak that you cannot stand on your own. Presumably, they have no capacity to tariff you. But secondly, even if they tariff you, that's fine. Why? You are not economically reliant. And that's why the POI was important, because what are they going to tariff you for if you do not import or export trade with one another? So that means that this harm is nonsensical. What is the flip here? It is worse when Western countries sanction you because they view you as complicit in, for example, Russia's effort to capture Ukraine. That means that you are locked out of export markets. That means that you have no access to international credit like loans from the World Bank or from the IMF. That means that you have massive amounts of capital flight that happens in Western countries, Western companies rather, that want to invest in you, but now are told by the European Union to leave you because you are helping Russia, especially that is trying to actively attack the European Union. Let's then deal with the comparative. Why is trade on the comparative better? First, it is access to multiple markets. So yes, maybe Russia is good. But the problem is, at the point where Russia, for example, decides to cook you, what happens on our side is you can still go to Western markets. You have that optionality. You can leverage with Russia and get, for example, better trade deals. Under their side, that economic union shackles your country and traps you to only trade with Russia, and therefore you lose all that leverage and optionality. But secondly, even if in the worst case we have to defend the EU primarily, that is fine. They're just simply more stable. For example, they're likely to establish long-term agreements because they're looking for a long-term reliable partner for oil. Their currency is relatively stable, at least relative to the rest of the world right now. They also have massive amounts of investment, oftentimes into member nations, because they want to, for example, develop the local industries, because they want to increase the value of the euro. Their only response to this is that, well, we grow by 2%. No, that often means that people and the amount of people that are in poverty increase because the amount of the rate in which goods are becoming more expensive does not match the economic productivity of that country. So it is not the worst. It's not just a case that you can take. It oftentimes means that a lot of people are likely to be harmed. I want to clarify the burden, right? Let's say that I lose this issue completely. This team needed to justify why status quo is so bad that we ought to join a union to which there are very speculative and uncertain benefits. Insofar as I'm able to just convince you that right now status quo is fine, it is stable enough, then presumably this policy is not necessary, and therefore all of the urgency does not matter. Before I go on to the last thing on comparative advantage, go ahead.
So how does Central Asian nations negotiate as individuals on your side? So the same burden you're pushing on us applies on your side when it comes to guaranteeing trading partners.
So one is European countries, despite being in the European Union, are individual. You can also, for example, trade with China and India. If, for example, a country, because they're small countries, cannot produce as much oil, they'll just go to the nearby Central Asian country. Like, there's a lot of ways that this currently happens. Citing the POI given by your partner, it has already happened. Okay, now let's talk about the comparative advantage. And the important thing here is that you economically succeeding as a country often undermines the interests of Russia. And I've been hinting at this. For example, it brings the oil prices that Russia wants to place down because there's more optionality. Secondly, it, for example, threatens the dominance they have over foreign markets like China and Russia. But generally, they also just want more control within the union. Insofar as you're richer, you have more ability to oppose Russian policies. This is important because even in their best case, there are incentives on the Russian government to place a cap on your development and make it that you, for example, are never really developing or prospering within that union. But let's assume benevolent incentives. These are all things that are unresponded to. One, you have the same exports and same buyers, even at the worst case where you don't think that's a harm, that means that there is no tangible benefit to these countries. Secondly, you kick out Western capital that currently exists and oftentimes is more benevolent. But thirdly, there are massive amounts of brain drain, which already worsens the economic conditions of these countries. For those reasons, propose.
Thank you. Welcoming op reply.
Okay. Hello. Can I be heard?
Yes, you can.
Thank you. Give me a sec. Okay. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Let's win this debate on 3 clean issues. The first, they say political urgency and security urgency, and that's why you want to create these establishments. The first thing we question is, what does Russia want from sanctioning you? Because their assumption is that Russia will invade you anyways, and so you want to offset this by getting membership. If the issue was security, again, just join a security union. There's no reason why they couldn't protect you any more than joining Russia and leaving yourself vulnerable to whatever they want economically and their political whims. Secondly, we'd argued, and we already did, that joining unions is much worse than the threat of a direct war. And this is for 3 broad reasons. 1, it legitimizes the relationship you have with Russia, and so it's much harder for you to future join security councils, but also protect yourself with conflicting states against them in the case that they do are more aggressive against you. Second, it drives you down with them further economically and makes it harder for you to separate with them and remove your interdependence. But thirdly, that it provides exactly what we explained is bad. And they explained this already. If Russia has every incentive to want to sanction you, to want to invade you, and this is only a means of padding that, we'd explain to you that's why all of the things we explain are likely to happen. They will outprice your domestic goods and beat out domestic industries because they want to take control of your economy. They will coerce you to forego more and more of your sovereignty through economic coercion, and because they want to be able to take over that state. They will take your labor and instill brain drain because you aren't in their best interest. They just want your economy. They just want your power. Very clearly, this already proves to you how you should weigh this. You ought weigh this by extents to use security councils or control Russian influence. On their side, you lose any means of control the moment you sign into that membership. You legitimize your relationship, which makes it harder for you to get the help, which is not only worse off longer, but it's establishing relations with the EU and security councils to combat these things. At the point of which you believe that war could be fought against, you lose that capacity to fight against war and against Russia at all times on their side. Second, then they shift their case to this idea of economic benefits. They assert that one, this is the only option because trade routes are not secured, but two, you remove competition between Central Asian states. I just want to vibe check this, right? The question from Riva in the POI was important. What do you actually trade with Russia? And I want you to weigh this on likelihood. Even if there was a higher likelihood to trade with Russia, because you're guaranteed this when you join the membership, the issue is it doesn't help you now in the future, and in fact negatively affects your economy for all the reasons all three speakers explained, like price dumping, like destroying your domestic economy, like making it harder for you to trade with other external economies that meant that you could keep Russia's influence in check. And so even if it was more likely that you could access a better trade partner within Russia, clearly they are not in your interest and it will drive your economy down worse. And so you shouldn't weigh it on that. But secondly, even if the EU was less likely to be a partner, you are at the very least sure it benefits you when it does. And if you outweigh it against these things, clearly at the very least, we are more beneficial. But even if you didn't believe that, and likelihood is the most important metric, even if nothing changed on our side, at the very least you grow instead of kill your own economy. And that in and of itself is worse. So if nothing happened, it's better than joining Russia and joining the EAEU. The last thing is an idea on negotiations. They say you need to be able to levy this in order to create more negotiating power between Central Asian states. The first thing I'd like to note is they give no reason why Russia needs you. You have the same products, you have the same partners, and oftentimes they are likely have the interest to destroy your economy in order to take advantage of and prop themselves up, like their oil prices and like their products. We give you several reasons why it's easier to negotiate with the EU because of interests that they currently have to trade with you. It is the scarcity of oil and the energy crisis that they want to resolve. It is access to a consumer base that was lost in the gap when Trump made all of these tax and tariffs. But thirdly, it was security issues that they themselves want to protect themselves from and stop conflict contagion within the area. That explain to you why it's easier comparatively to negotiate with the EU because they actually want to trade with you and need you to some extent. But I'd argue, even if you didn't believe that you could negotiate, it's still better even if you had none. You still have better and more sustainable ability to access currency, better trade partners, and better access to international trade. Even if you couldn't argue against them, you couldn't do it with Russia either.
Thank you, Reply. To close out the debate, Reply.
Hello. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Opposition operates on hope and many unsure speculations. Prop operates on the facts we know, aware that situations will change, but there's an urgency to do something as soon as possible. A few technical call-outs. The first is to point out that OP as a whole ignores a lot of the nuances we've spent in our constructive speeches and wants to sum up our case as a straw man about how we fear we will get sanctioned. That was one of the many reasonable fears, but that wasn't even the main one. We talked about how we have ongoing wars when it comes to tariffs and trade wars, military wars in neighboring nations that need to be dealt with, how the geopolitical location and considerations make it hard for other negotiations and other trade partnerships to exist outside of a membership of a union. I don't think limiting the debate actively through ignoring things is good debating. Claiming we shifted as well is very insulting to the entire speech I made, where literally everything was about the economic sustainability of it. The second call out, when we brought up everything about how it was going to affect an invasion, guys, this is what being responsive and engaging is. That wasn't an entire case. It was an even if case. It was a worst case scenario case. There was an entire gov case about economic protections and inclusive union benefits that are still standing and you don't deal with. You can't just shift away for it because it's convenient for you. The third thing to call out, there were very late builds, adding reasons for the alternative of working trade relations that popped up in DLO, only new ones to the EU when I raised that POI, additional things about food security and OPWIP. I don't think it's fair for them to build a case as they go. The second thing I'm going to do is to show how their alternative actually has no teeth because it relies on a lot of factors that simply don't exist and they did not prove. The first false factor that they lean on is that other people will want to trade with them and that they can. The first thing they push, right, is that the EU trade can do it. LO brings it up and then DLO decides to build it rather late. But I don't think that they managed to prove this because, as I mentioned, and Mikko concedes to this as well, they haven't. They haven't to the same degree. That means there are things that are hindering them from doing so. The second thing we pointed out is how, because of the situation going on with Ukraine, which is their direct line to be able to trade. Remember, like Central Asia is rather landlocked. They have a lake nearby, sure, but they still has to go through Russia and Ukraine to get there. But the third thing, and we raised this as well, it's kind of ridiculous for them to claim that it's going to happen later, that it's only been a week. Because if the prices were really that good and they were that preferable as a trade partner over everyone else that was going through this conflict, which isn't new, by the way, the conflict has been going on for so long, they would have been partners with the EU already. They weren't. Unless you're arguing that the EU was too dumb to notice them, I think that it's much more believable to say that there are external and geographical hindrances that prevent them from being able to have those trades. We also pointed out that the tariffs won't really change because of the geopolitical location of things. Even if they do trade, we like engage with this, even though it's a ridiculous point. We talked about how there's active like political retaliation from China and Russia, who are closer to you than Europe. So there are more direct threats. And the best course of action is to not anger those that are along your borders that can probably harm you. But okay, fine. Assuming this is the case, we still boil it down to, in terms of likelihood, it's a speculation on their part that the EU will probably want to trade. But the harms already of everything else we pointed out are guaranteed, and they needed to deal with that with something beyond a pure wish. The second false factor they brought up is that being independent is actually more freeing. But we pointed out, this is true, and if you are able to position yourself. This is true if geopolitical locations make it strategic for you. It is true if the union is so bad that everyone would have left. Because a lot of their arguments seem to be arguments against being part of any trade union, losing some level of autonomy, losing your ability to choose, losing your independence in being able to choose. Then maybe get rid of all unions. But the fact is they do exist because there's a strategic reason for doing so. It's a high-risk strategy for them to go solo. Because again, the more neutral you are, the more you become a target. For all these reasons and more, very, very proud to propose.
Thank you, both teams, for the wonderful debate.